Hi, I'm Malcolm.
And I'm Rachel. We're two Canadians living on our 39-foot mainship trawler, living an adventure of a lifetime. We invite you to follow along as we travel 6,000 miles through Canadian and U.S. waterways around America's Great Loop. On this episode, we're going to share with you some of the things we do in preparation before each trip. So we do need to make sure we go through the steps each time to ensure our own safety, the boat's safety, and for the safety of other boaters around us. But even before we start the engine, there's a routine we go through to secure the boat to prepare to move. Before every trip, we do a number of things in preparation before we leave. The night before, we carefully check the weather and wind forecast to ensure our plan is still good for the next day. Before we go to sleep, we know what time we plan to leave, so if it's an early departure, we can be ready on time. It's really important to double check, especially the wind forecast. There are minor changes depending if we are at a dock or at anchor. If we're at anchor, we likely have the dinghy launched and have it tied to the back, so we would need to bring it up and secure it with the davit system onto the swim platform. If we're in port, we would normally not have launched the dinghy, so we could skip this step. Before we prepare anything else on the boat, the most important part is to check the engine, and this is under the floor in the salon.
So every time before we leave, we have to check the engine. And it's just good practice to make sure that there's nothing wrong with anything before you start it. Because if you start it wrong, it could fail. We only have one engine. So what we do is we look in here first, just overall. Is there anything in the engine that looks out of ordinary? Look for the battery connections, make sure they're good. Do you see anything in the bilge that wasn't there when you last looked? Water, oil, anything like that. Then you look into what we have here, which is our sea strainer. And what I do is I take a flashlight and I basically look behind the sea strainer just to see if there's lots of weeds or anything else that could block the engine, because this is the main water intake for the engine. Check the hoses and make sure they're not soft. They're all nice and firm, which they are. So that's done for the water. If it is dirty, you undo these. You can do this without turning the seacock off if you want. And then from there, you can actually lift it out and just clean it and put it back in. One caution, if the seal isn't good, you won't get water into your engine. That happened to us. The other thing that I will do is I'll check to ensure that the filter, I have a pressure gauge on the filter, which is right here. And I've set it so that if it gets to 7 bars, it shows the filter's clogged, the more pressure going through the fuel as it feeds into the engine. So I can see it, and then I know when to change my filter. The only thing that a diesel engine, or only two things a diesel engine really needs, is fuel and air. As long as it's got that, this makes sure that the fuel is still getting there. So water, fuel, anything out of ordinary. I do check the fan belts, because the fan belt, just to make sure it's not too loose. That's at the front of the engine, run on our alternator. I've already done that, so I won't do it again. And the last thing I do is I check, the second last thing I do is I check the oil. So that yellow dipstick right there, what I do is I get a rag. And the first pull really doesn't mean anything because it all gets smushed up, so you just clean that off. The second one is the one that's going to tell you, do you have any oil? Or do you need to top it up? And what I do is I look at it and I can see, and you can see there, that it's actually right on full. So we are okay with oil. And that is the second last thing I do. The last thing I do, and sometimes it's not always in the same order, I'll check the coolant, which is right here. And the coolant needs to be on cold. So right here, there's a cold line. Again, this makes sure the engine has enough coolant so that when we're running, it doesn't overheat. And that seems fine.
You also have a camera in the back there.
I do. So right here is a camera. I have this camera pointing backwards into the engine room. And the reason for that is when I'm underway, if we're going for multiple hours, And it's a good idea to always check your engine every hour. And what I do is I always have this camera open. It can see the gauge that's right here. That tells me at a glance, is my filter clogging? Should I pull over and change the filter and then continue before the engine stops? So it's always a good idea to be preventative versus wait till something happens. This is just one more thing. This camera allows us to be preventative just before we get into problems.
Even on seemingly calm weather days, we can encounter swells or waves from other boaters, causing the boat to rock around. For this reason, we need to lock all the cupboards and even the fridge, and also put heavy items where they can't fall. Next, we put all our valuables into the dry bag in case we need to leave the boat in a hurry. Change to battery 1. Turning everything on at the lower helm. Turning on the radio, turning on the GPS, the VHF, the depth sounder. Now that all that preparation is done, we can start the engine. After starting the engine, it's very important to make sure there's water coming out of the exhaust. This is what helps cool the engine. Next, it's time to bring up the anchor. Here you can see Malcolm clearing the chain to make sure it doesn't get all bunched up inside the anchor locker. And if necessary, if there's a lot of mud on the chain or the anchor itself, we need to hose it off to make sure it doesn't get all over the boat. When we leave, we communicate our float plan with our family by cell phone and/or with this device using satellite. This is a Garmin InReach Mini 2. Once we're underway, we can bring up the fenders. Unless we're locking through, we'll leave the fenders out and bring them up and down as necessary. And throughout our journey, we check our charts carefully, monitor all the systems on the boat, and of course check the weather continuously. Binoculars are an invaluable tool when boating, checking for markers or other boaters or any obstruction. And hopefully all of this preparation minimizes any problems along the way, making for a safe and enjoyable trip.